She looked me in the eye and said, "I love you, but I'd be embarrassed introducing you to certain people." I calmly paid the bill and left without arguing. A year later, she sat speechless after seeing my face featured in a national magazine cover story. "I love you. I genuinely do. But if I'm being completely honest." She set her wine glass down, looked me straight in the eye. "There are certain people in my life I'd be embarrassed introducing you to." I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just sat there, across from her at that candlelit table in the restaurant we'd been coming to for 2 years, with the breadbasket between us and Sinatra playing softly somewhere overhead. And I let those words land exactly where she threw them. Embarrassed. That was the word she chose. Not nervous. Not unsure. Not even worried about timing. Embarrassed. Like I was something she'd accidentally stepped in. I reached across the table, picked up the check the waiter had quietly placed there 10 minutes earlier, looked at the total, and set my card on top of it without a word. She kept talking. I stopped hearing her. A few minutes later, I signed the receipt, stood up, put on my jacket, and said, "Drive safe, Sloan." Then I walked out. No argument. No scene. No tears in the parking lot. Just the cold November air hitting my face, and the quiet understanding that something had just ended. Not with a bang. Not with screaming or thrown dishes or any of the dramatic finality people write about, but with a single sentence over a glass of Malbec. I didn't know it then, but that moment, that one quiet, terrible moment, was the beginning of everything. A year later, she would sit across a table from someone, a magazine open in front of her, and she would go completely silent, because the face on the cover would be mine. I should tell you what I had to lose, because when you walk out of a restaurant like that, calm and quiet, people assume you didn't care. They assume it was easy. It wasn't. Sloan Whitfield had been the center of my life for 2 years and 8 months. I know that sounds like a strange thing to quantify, but when something ends, you count it. You count every month, every season, every version of yourself that existed inside that relationship. She was the person I called when I got good news. She was the person whose laugh I could hear from across a crowded room and feel something move in my chest. She knew how I took my coffee, which side of the bed I slept on, why I got quiet at family dinners, and what to say when the old anxiety crept back in after a long stretch of bad weeks. And I loved her. Fully. Maybe too fully, if that's even a real thing. Which is why, when I walked to my car that night, I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before I turned the key. Not crying. Not calling anyone. Just sitting. Processing the particular kind of pain that comes not from being hated by someone, but from being quietly looked down on by someone who also claimed to love you. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. Not immediately, not dramatically, but the way a crack in a wall changes things, slowly, structurally, until one day the whole surface shifts. What I had to lose was simple. A relationship I'd built my life around. A future I'd mentally sketched out in detail. A version of myself that only existed in relation to her. Those are heavy things to walk away from. Which is exactly why, when I finally drove home that night, I made a decision. I was going to stop apologizing for who I was. I was going to become someone who didn't need her approval. And then I was going to build something so undeniable that the word embarrassed would never apply to me again. I just didn't know yet what that would look like. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. My name is Caleb Mercer. I was 29 years old when this story begins. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. High ceilings, good light in the mornings, a kitchen where I'd taught myself to cook properly over the course of a pandemic and a series of terrible takeout experiences. I worked as a narrative content strategist for a mid-sized digital media company called Vantage Publishing, which occupied 4 floors of a building in Midtown that always smelled faintly of printer ink and someone's reheated lunch. The job was good, not glamorous. Nobody was writing profiles about me. Nobody was stopping me at industry events to ask for my card. But it was solid, honest work that I was genuinely good at. I wrote long-form editorial content, developed audience strategy, worked with brand partners on storytelling campaigns. I understood what made people pay attention. I understood structure, rhythm, emotional stakes. I just hadn't applied any of that to my own life yet. That was the irony I'd spend the next year sitting with. My strengths: I was patient, disciplined in ways that didn't always show on the surface. I could sit with an idea for weeks, turning it over, until I found the angle that made it work. I was loyal to the point of being stubborn about it. I was a good listener, which in New York is a rarer quality than it should be. My weaknesses, I minimized myself. Not in a theatrical, self-deprecating way, just quietly. Took up less room than I should have. Accepted conditions I shouldn't have accepted because I was so focused on the other person's comfort that I forgot about my own. I had dreams that were specific and real, not vague wishes, but a clear picture. I wanted to build something of my own. A publication, a media brand, something independent, something with a voice that was entirely mine. I'd been slowly working toward it for 2 years. Nights and weekends, a document on my laptop that I kept adding to, refining. I hadn't told many people. Sloane knew. Sort of. She knew in the way people know about something you've mentioned, but they've never fully engaged with. The way they nod and say that sounds interesting, and then ask what you want for dinner. My insecurities were quieter, buried deeper. I worried about being underestimated in rooms where credentials were the first currency exchanged. I hadn't gone to an Ivy. I'd gone to NYU on partial scholarship, worked part-time throughout, graduated with a degree I'd had to fight for. I wasn't from money. My father was a contractor from the Bronx who built things with his hands and never once complained about it. My mother taught 3rd grade in the same school for 22 years. They were good, solid people who gave me everything they could. But in certain rooms, certain very specific New York rooms, that background was its own kind of invisible mark. And Sloane moved in those rooms. Let me tell you about Sloane. Because she wasn't a villain. That's the most important thing I can tell you. And it's the part of this story that makes it harder and more honest than the version where she's simply terrible. Sloane Whitfield was 28, a junior associate at a boutique investment firm called Hartwell & Cross, on a trajectory that she had been carefully planning since approximately age 19. She was sharp, genuinely, impressively sharp. She read everything: financial journals, literary fiction, the kind of long-form journalism that most people bookmarked and never finished. She had opinions about wine, about architecture, about what made a neighborhood worth living in. She was funny in a dry, precise way that caught you off guard. She had this habit of tilting her head slightly when she was really listening to you, really tracking every word, and it made you feel seen in a way that was almost addictive. She was beautiful, dark hair, serious dark eyes, the kind of polished, composed look that read differently in different rooms. In a coffee shop, she looked like a novelist. In a boardroom, she looked like the most dangerous person present. Her goal was to make partner before 40. She would probably do it. Her fear, though she never named it directly, was irrelevance. Being the person in the room who didn't quite fit. Being the name that didn't open doors. She had grown up comfortable, but not wealthy. A family from the Upper West Side where appearances were carefully maintained and social positioning was treated almost like a professional skill. Her mother had married well, twice. Her older sister had married a hedge fund manager and now lived in a townhouse in the West Village and hosted dinner parties that got written up in lifestyle publications. Sloane was still climbing, and there was nothing wrong with ambition. The flaw, the specific, structural flaw that would define everything, was that Sloane had begun to confuse the map for the territory. She was so focused on how things looked that she'd started losing track of how things felt. She wanted a life that photographed well, a relationship that impressed people at the right parties. And me, Caleb Mercer from Astoria, content strategist, NYU graduate, son of a contractor, I was starting to look like a liability in the picture she was composing. She hadn't always felt that way. That's the part that still gets me, even now. We met at a mutual friend's gallery opening in Chelsea. This was about 3 years before the restaurant. I wasn't supposed to be there. My friend Marcus, who I'd known since college, had been given 2 extra invitations by a colleague and called me at 6 o'clock on a Thursday with the kind of energy that meant I shouldn't say no. "It'll be good for you," he said. "You've been inside too much." He wasn't wrong. I put on a decent jacket and went. The gallery was warm and crowded and smelled like white wine and the kind of mild pretension that I'd always found more amusing than annoying. I was standing in front of a large black and white photograph, a fire escape, a woman half visible through a window, morning light doing extraordinary things to ordinary surfaces, when someone stepped up beside me. "Most of the other ones are better," she said. I turned. She was looking at the photograph with the slight head tilt I would come to know well. "You think?" I said. "This one's trying too hard to be iconic," she said. "The ones in the back corner just are what they are." That's more interesting to me. I thought about that for a second. You're saying effort shows. I'm saying effort to impress shows. Effort to do the work doesn't. That was Sloane, right there, in that first sentence. Something that was either a piece of genuine wisdom or a coded preview. Probably both. We talked for 2 hours. Forgot about the wine. Forgot about Marcus. We covered 3 neighborhoods. For career frustrations, one shared read of a novel neither of us had admitted to liking that much, and the specific kind of loneliness that comes from living in a city full of people who are all moving very fast in directions that don't always intersect with yours. By the time we left, walking out together, neither of us having planned to, I knew I wanted to see her again. She gave me her number without me asking. I was going to wait for you to ask, she said, but you seemed like you might overthink it. I laughed. She wasn't wrong about that either. The first year was the kind of year that makes you believe in things. We did all of it. Weekend mornings in the West Village when the streets were still quiet and the coffee shops hadn't filled up yet. Long walks across bridges for no reason except that we both liked the feeling of being between two places. A road trip up to Vermont in October. Her idea, where we got lost twice and found a diner that served the best pie either of us had ever eaten. And we sat in a window booth for 3 hours just talking while the leaves outside turned colors that didn't seem real. She came to a reading I did. I'd submitted a piece to a small literary journal, and they'd invited the contributors for an evening. And she sat in the front row, and when I looked up from the page, she was watching me with an expression that I would describe, even now, as pride. That meant something. It meant everything, actually. I fixed a bookshelf in her apartment one Saturday afternoon, and she made pasta, and we ate it on her floor because her table was covered in work files and neither of us wanted to move them. And it was one of the best meals I've ever had. I met her parents once, early on. Her father was a quiet, thoughtful man who asked good questions. Her mother asked questions too, but the questions were a different kind, the kind designed to establish things. Where did you go to school? What does your company do? Do you have plans to move into management? I answered everything honestly. Her mother smiled the whole time. I couldn't fully read the smile. Sloane squeezed my hand under the table. I decided it was fine. I decided a lot of things were fine that I should have looked at more carefully. But I was happy. I want you to understand that. I was genuinely, specifically, thoroughly happy in a way I hadn't been in years. Sloane made me feel like the best version of myself was not only possible, but already present, like she could see it even when I couldn't. That's a powerful thing to give someone. And it's why, when she started slowly taking it back, I didn't notice at first. The first thing I remember was small. We were at a dinner party at her friend Piper's apartment. This was maybe 8 months into the relationship, maybe 9. Piper was sharp and well-dressed and worked in private equity and had the kind of apartment in the East Village that made you do mental math about salaries. There were 8 people around the table. I knew 2 of them, Sloane and Marcus, who'd been dating Piper's colleague for a few months. The conversation moved through finance, through real estate, through a recent deal one of the guys, Connor, I think, late 30s, blazer with no tie, had just closed. I listened, contributed where it felt natural, said something about a piece I'd read on media consolidation that got a couple of nods. Nothing spectacular, but nothing embarrassing either. On the walk home, Sloane was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet we'd built between us, but a different kind, a slightly pressurized quiet. You okay? I asked. Fine, she said. Just tired. Then, after half a block, you got a little lost when Connor was talking about the structured finance stuff. I had. Connor had been explaining something technical, and I hadn't followed all of it. Yeah, I said. Not really my area. I know, she said. 2 words. I know. Said in a tone I couldn't quite name. Not cruel. Not even clearly unkind. Just waited. I filed it away and kept walking. What happened next surprised me. Because I thought it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. Over the next few months, I started to notice a pattern. Not a dramatic pattern. Nothing you could point to and say there, that's the problem. Just a slow, steady accumulation of small moments that individually meant nothing, but collectively meant something. At a rooftop party in Brooklyn, she introduced me to 2 people from her firm. This is Caleb, she said. He's in publishing. Which was true, technically, but I'd never heard her describe it quite that flatly before. No context, no color, none of the enthusiasm she'd shown when she told her sister about my work 8 months earlier. Just, he's in publishing. Like it was a category, not a person. A few weeks later, I mentioned the independent media project I'd been building. I'd been working on it more seriously, had a clearer structure, had even started reaching out to a couple of potential contributors. Still working on that thing, she said. That thing. I looked at her. She was scrolling through her phone, the question already half forgotten. I said yes and changed the subject. Then there was the night of her firm's holiday party. This was a bigger deal. The kind of event where the whole ecosystem showed up, where careers were quietly assessed in the spaces between cocktail conversations. I wore my best suit. She'd helped me pick it out, actually, 6 months earlier, in a moment that felt like care. Now, in the elevator up to the venue, she looked me over and said, "You look nice." Nice. Not the word you want to hear when you've been dressing for a room. Inside, she moved differently. Not away from me. She stayed close, stayed attentive, but there was a performance quality to it that I hadn't felt before. A slightly elevated presentation of herself that subtly, almost imperceptibly, positioned me as supporting cast. Her colleague Nathaniel talked to me for a while about media trends. He was genuinely interested, genuinely engaged. I liked him immediately, but when I referenced him later, Nathaniel seemed great. Sloane said, "He's fine, he's just very talky," and moved on. Like my judgment about people was also something to be managed. I should have said something. I know that now. Looking back, I missed something obvious. Every time I started to feel smaller around her, I blamed the room, or the crowd, or my own sensitivity, instead of looking at what she was actually doing. It's important that I tell you about Jeffrey. Jeffrey Caldwell was Sloane's close friend from college. They'd gone to Georgetown together, had stayed in each other's lives through multiple apartments and jobs and relationships. He was, by any objective measure, charming. Tall, easy-moving, the kind of effortlessly assembled person who made good parties better just by being present. He worked in venture capital, had invested early in 3 companies that were now genuinely significant, and he wore all of it lightly enough that you almost missed how central it was to his identity. Almost. I liked Jeffrey at first. He was funny. He was warm to me when we met, asked real questions, laughed at things I said. But over time I started to understand that Jeffrey had a specific function in Sloane's life. He was her benchmark. Not romantically. I want to be clear about that, because this isn't that story, but socially, professionally, aspirationally. Jeffrey represented, for Sloane, what success looked like assembled into a person. And I started to notice that after time spent with Jeffrey, Sloane would come home slightly recalibrated, slightly more dissatisfied, like she'd been reminded of a standard I wasn't meeting. There was a Sunday brunch, Jeffrey, his girlfriend Kimberly, Sloane, and me, at a place in the West Village that Kimberly had just had written up in a food publication she contributed to. Kimberly was interesting on her own terms. A food and culture writer who'd recently published a book and had the kind of specific, confident presence that came from being really good at something and knowing it without needing to announce it. I liked her immediately and genuinely. She and I ended up talking for most of the meal about long-form storytelling, about the economics of independent media, about what made something worth reading in a moment when everything was competing for the same fractured attention. It was one of the best conversations I'd had in months. Afterward, walking home, I was still riding the energy of it. "That was great," I said. "Kimberly is incredible." Sloane nodded. "She's very successful," she said. "Jeffrey says her book Advance was significant." That was her takeaway from Kimberly. Not the ideas, not the mind, the advance. I looked at her for a moment. She was looking down the street, already somewhere else. I didn't say anything, but something shifted in me that afternoon. Quietly, permanently. There was a night, about 4 months before the restaurant, where we had a fight that should have been the fight. Should have been the moment we either fixed it or ended it cleanly. Instead, it became a managed disagreement that we papered over with a nice dinner and a resolution to communicate better. It had started with a career conversation. I'd been offered a promotion at Vantage, senior strategist, small team of my own, meaningful raise. I was genuinely excited. I came home and told her over dinner. She smiled and said congratulations and poured us wine. Then, "Are you going to take it?" "Yeah," I said. "I mean, probably. Why wouldn't I?" She hesitated. "That's small, tell everything hesitation. I just think it's worth asking whether Vantage is really where you want to be long-term, or whether you're taking the promotion because it's available, not because it's actually what you want." She wasn't wrong. It was a fair question, but the way she asked it, the slight curling of the phrasing, the careful neutrality that wasn't quite neutral, said something underneath the words. Is this really ambitious enough for the kind of person I want to be with? I'm also still building the independent project, I said. The promotion would actually give me more resources too. The independent project, she said. Not interrupting, exactly. Just responding to the phrase with a tone that made it sound, again, like that thing. I set my fork down. You don't think it's viable. I think it's a passion project, she said, which is different from a business. A lot of businesses started as passion projects. A lot of passion projects stayed passion projects. Silence. She looked at me. I just want you to be realistic, she said. I'm not trying to be negative. But she was. And what was underneath the realism, underneath the careful concern, was something more uncomfortable. She was building a life around a certain kind of success. And she was quietly doing the math on whether I fit into that life. She wasn't telling me to become someone different. She was wondering, out loud, very carefully, whether I already was. I swallowed all of it. I said, I hear you. Which is what you say when you don't know what else to say. We moved on. Pattern interrupt. 3 weeks later, I found out she'd told Piper that she wasn't sure the relationship had a ceiling. I found out from Marcus, who found out from Piper, who probably shouldn't have told him. I didn't confront her. I stored it and kept going. Let me tell you about a night that still matters to me, not for what went wrong, but for what went right. This was maybe 6 months before the restaurant, deep in a New York January, one of those nights where the cold is so specific and complete that it changes the texture of everything. Sloan had a work dinner she'd been dreading all week. A senior partner's retirement celebration, long and formal and loaded with the kind of professional theater that exhausted her even as she excelled at it. She came home at 11:30, still in her coat, shoes in her hand, makeup faded. She looked, for once, completely unguarded. I had food waiting. Nothing elaborate. Leftover soup from earlier that week that I'd reheated, bread I'd picked up from the place on the corner, a glass of wine already poured. She sat down at the kitchen table, looked at it, looked at me, and for a second her face did something complicated, like a series of locked rooms opening in sequence. How did you know I needed exactly this? She said. I know you, I said. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, I know. That's the thing. We sat at that table for 2 hours. She talked about her family, about the pressure she felt that she almost never named, about her father's quiet disappointment when she chose finance over something more creative, about the way she'd built her whole professional self around a definition of success she wasn't sure she'd chosen or just inherited. I listened, really listened. This was the Sloan I loved, the one underneath the performance, the one who got tired, who had doubts, who could sit at a kitchen table at midnight with day-old soup and say real things. I want you to hold on to that memory, because it makes everything that followed harder to explain and more important to understand. She wasn't all one thing. Neither was I. That's always the truth about the relationships that matter. There's a person I haven't mentioned yet who matters to this story. Her name is Nicole Ferrara. Nicole was Sloan's closest friend from their first years in the city. They'd met at a networking event for young women in finance and become fast friends within a month. Nicole was, in many ways, everything Sloan wanted to be. She'd made VP at her bank at 31, was newly engaged to a real estate developer who seemed genuinely good, had just bought an apartment in Tribeca. I liked Nicole. She was direct in the way that people who've earned their confidence tend to be direct, not harsh, not performative, just clear. She'd always been warm to me, or so I thought. It was Nicole who, I learned later, had been having the conversations with Sloan that I could never quite hear. Not malicious conversations, just honest ones. The kind that happen between close friends when one of them is building toward a version of her life that her current relationship doesn't fully fit. Nicole had asked Sloan, some months before the restaurant, a question that was both simple and devastating. Do you see him in the life you're building? The whole life? I know about this because Nicole told me herself, later, much later. By then the answer had already been acted on. The night of the restaurant. Let me place it precisely. This was a Friday in November. We'd had a fine week. Not a bad week. Not a particularly good one. Just the ordinary texture of two busy people maintaining a shared life across two boroughs and two very different professional worlds. We'd chosen the restaurant because it was ours, in the particular way that couples have places that belong to them. The corner table, the waiter who knew our order, the ritual of it. I knew something was coming. I want to be honest about that. I knew the way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes. Something in the pressure of the preceding days, the slight formal quality she'd had all week, the careful way she'd been choosing her words. I didn't know what form it would take. I didn't expect the form it took. We ordered. We talked about her week, about a project I'd been developing, about a friend's engagement that had been announced on social media. The food came. We ate. And then, in the space between the main course and the moment the waiter would come back to ask about dessert, she set her wine glass down and looked at me with the expression of someone who has rehearsed something and is now delivering it. I've been thinking about us, she said. Okay, I said. I think we need to be honest with each other. I've always been honest with you, I said. She nodded, acknowledging that. I know you have, she said. I'm not saying you haven't been. Pause. I love you, she said. I genuinely do. And then the sentence. The specific, carefully assembled sentence that she had clearly prepared, that she had probably turned over in her mind for days, that she thought was honest and adult and clear, and that was all of those things, and also, underneath all of those things, a kind of contempt dressed up as candor. But if I'm being completely honest, there are certain people in my life I'd be embarrassed introducing you to. I looked at her. She held my gaze. She was waiting, I think, for an argument, for me to defend myself, for me to ask which people, and why, and what would it take. The old version of me might have. The version of me that had been quietly shrinking for a year to fit the dimensions she'd decided were appropriate. That version would have leaned forward and started negotiating. Instead, I reached for the check, looked at the total, put my card down. She kept talking. I didn't hear the words. I signed. I stood up. Drive safe, Sloan. And I walked out. The cold air was exact and clarifying. I sat in my car for a long time. I thought about the brunch with Kimberly and the holiday party and the word nice in the elevator and the phrase that thing and every small moment of quiet diminishment that I'd filed away without acting on. I thought about the kitchen table at midnight and the Vermont road trip and the gallery opening and her expression in the front row when I read. I thought about who I was and who I'd allowed myself to become in her presence. Then I started the car. And I drove home. And I got to work. The first week after was the week of silence. Not dramatic silence. I didn't smash anything. I didn't post anything. I didn't call anyone with the story. I just went quiet. She texted twice. The first time, I think we should talk about what happened. The second time, a day later, I'm not trying to hurt you. I just thought honesty was important. I read both messages. I didn't respond to either. I wasn't punishing her. I was just done with that conversation. It had already happened. The question now was what came next. What happened next surprised me. Because instead of the spiral I expected, the grief, the empty weekends, the loss of the future I'd been imagining, what came was something quieter and stranger and, ultimately, more useful. Clarity. Pure, specific, actionable clarity. Like a room that's been slightly out of focus your whole life, and someone has finally adjusted the lens. I saw myself clearly for the first time in a long time. I saw what I'd been doing, what I'd been accepting, what I'd been telling myself was fine. And I saw what I actually wanted. Which was simple, really. I wanted to build the thing. The media project, the independent publication I'd been sketching and planning and slowly, quietly, almost apologetically developing for 2 years. I wanted to build it fully. Without hedging. Without apology. Without the ambient static of someone else's doubt running underneath everything I did. I sat at my kitchen table that first Saturday morning, opened the document, and looked at what I had. It was good. Actually good. I'd been so close to it for so long, and so accustomed to having it treated as a side project, that I'd almost stopped seeing how much was actually there. The concept was strong. A long-form digital publication focused on creative entrepreneurs and independent thinkers, people building things outside traditional institutions, doing work that didn't fit clean categories. I had relationships. I had skills. I had, working at Vantage for 3 years, a specific and detailed understanding of how media brands were built and what made them last. And I had, for the first time in a long time, nothing to lose. I took the promotion at Vantage, not as the ending, but as the foundation. I showed up every day and I was better at my job than I'd been before, sharper, more focused, cleaner in my thinking, because I'd stopped splitting my energy between the work and the management of someone else's opinion of the work. And at night, and on weekends, I built. Russell came in at month 2. Russell Park was someone I'd known since my first year at Vantage, a product designer who'd gone independent 2 years earlier and was doing remarkable work in the editorial design space. We'd always gotten along, had lunch occasionally, talked about things neither of us was doing yet. I called him on a Sunday afternoon and told him what I was building. Not the hedged version, the real version. He was quiet for a moment. Then, send me what you have. I sent it. He called me back within an hour. This is really good, Caleb. I know, I said. And that was the first time I'd said those words about my own work to another person without immediately following them with a qualification. Russell became my creative partner, not in a formal business sense, not yet, but in the way that the best partnerships start. Two people who think while together working on something they both believe in. He brought the visual language that the project needed. I brought the editorial architecture. Together, we started building what would eventually become Foundry. That was the name we landed on after 3 weeks of trying other names. Foundry, the place where raw material becomes something. We thought it was right. We were right. Month 3, I started running in the mornings. This sounds small. It wasn't. I'd been trying to start running consistently for 3 years, always finding a reason not to. Too early, too cold, too tired after work. Now I ran every morning. Not for performance, not to lose weight or prove anything. Just for the specific mental quiet that came in the first 20 minutes, before the ideas started arriving, when it was just movement and cold air and the city waking up around me. I lost 11 pounds over the following 6 months. Didn't track it. Just noticed one day in March that my clothes fit differently. I slept better. I thought more clearly. I started cooking more deliberately. I reorganized my apartment. Small changes, practical ones, but the kind that signaled something internal. This is a place where someone serious lives. Marcus noticed. We had dinner in February. First time I'd seen him since the breakup. He'd heard about it from Piper, and I could see him calculating how carefully to proceed. You okay? He asked. Better than okay, I said, and meant it. He looked at me for a moment. You seem different. Different how? He thought about it. Like you took up more room, he said finally. I should tell you what I found out. Because not all of it came from my own reflection. Some of it came from the world doing what it does, which is eventually circulate information back to you. Marcus told me, about 6 weeks after the breakup, that Sloane had started seeing someone named Declan Ashworth. He worked in private equity, a lateral move from her own world, predictably, and was, by every social metric that Sloane valued, the correct person. His LinkedIn, which I looked at once and then never again, was a clean narrative of the right schools, the right firms, the right progression. I thought about how she must have felt introducing him to people. Then I stopped thinking about it. What hurt more, and this is the truth I wasn't ready for immediately, was what else Marcus told me. That Sloane had been having concerns about the relationship for over a year. A year. She'd talked to Nicole about it, to Piper about it, probably to her sister about it. The whole social ecosystem around her had known she was reconsidering, had been holding the information, while I was showing up to dinner parties and holiday parties and friend brunches completely unaware. Not because they were cruel, because these things happen in social groups, and the information rarely travels cleanly. But it reframed things. The dinner party where I got lost in the structured finance stuff. The holiday party where I was supporting cast. The brunch where Kimberly's advance was more interesting than Kimberly. All of it recalibrated. She hadn't been disappointed in a moment. She'd been checking me against a standard for a long time, and I'd been failing the check without knowing I was being tested. The feeling wasn't anger. It was something closer to grief, and something closer to relief. Grief for the version of the relationship I'd believed in. Relief, because now I understood the shape of what I'd been living inside. And resolve. Quiet, specific, durable resolve. I ignored the warning. For too long, I ignored it. But I wasn't ignoring anything anymore. Month 4 was when Foundry started to become real. We launched a newsletter. Not a formal launch. No press release. No social campaign. Just a newsletter that we sent to 112 people. Colleagues, former contacts, people we respected in the industry, a few writers we hoped would contribute. The open rate was 61%. That's extremely high. 3 writers responded within a week, interested in contributing. One of them was someone whose work I'd been reading for 4 years. I remember reading her email and sitting back in my chair and feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Confidence. Not the performed kind. Not the confidence you put on to walk into a room. The real kind. The kind that comes from building something, watching it work, and knowing that you understand why it works. We published our first feature in month 5. A deep profile of a sculptor who'd walked away from a tenured position at a major university to build her practice independently. The financial risk, the creative freedom, the specific terror and joy of removing the safety net. It was beautiful. Russell's design elevated the text in ways I hadn't anticipated. We shared it quietly. By the end of the week, it had been shared widely by enough people in the right places that we got 4 inbound emails from writers who'd heard about us. I want to be honest about something. There's a version of this story where the success comes fast and clean and feels like a movie. It didn't. Month 5 was also the month I had 3 pieces fall through, lost a potential advertiser, and had a late night where I sat with Russell over takeout ramen wondering whether we were building something or just playing at it. Is this actually working? I asked. Russell thought about it. Yes, he said, just not as fast as we want. How do you know? Because people who actually make things in this world are paying attention to us, he said. That doesn't happen by accident. He was right. I kept going. In month 6, I got a call I wasn't expecting. From Kimberly, Jeffrey's girlfriend. Now, I'd heard, his fiancée. We hadn't spoken since that brunch. She'd gotten my number from Marcus, she explained, apologizing for the reach. She was writing a piece for a national magazine, a cultural essay about independent media builders, people building new kinds of publications outside the traditional structures. She'd heard about Foundry. She wanted to include us. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. How did you hear about it? I asked. I follow the newsletter, she said. I've been reading it since you launched. It's really good, Caleb. I thought about the brunch. About talking with her for 2 hours. About Sloan summarizing her in terms of a book advance. Thank you, I said. I'd love to talk. We had lunch at a place in the West Village. 2 hours again, just like the brunch. She was warm and rigorous and asked good questions. At the end, she said, I'm going to be honest. When I pitched this story, I had you and 3 other people in mind. But talking to you today, I think you might be the heart of it. I didn't know what to say. I'm not trying to oversell it, she said. I just mean, what you're building is the thing. Not the thing adjacent to the thing. The actual thing. I drove home and sat in my apartment for a long time. What I had to lose, that November night at the restaurant, had seemed enormous. What I'd actually lost was a version of myself that was always too small. The months that followed were the months of accumulation. Not dramatic accumulation. Just the slow, steady building of something real. Foundry grew. We added 2 contributors. Then a third, who had previously written for places I'd read for years and never imagined approaching. Our newsletter had grown from 112 to over 14,000. The piece Kimberly was writing moved through editorial, got a publication date, then got pushed, then placed, then got promoted, then got something I didn't anticipate. A cover. Not a news cover. A culture cover. The kind of long-form, portrait with story cover that magazines reserve for people they want to present as worth knowing about. The magazine was The Atlantic. I need to let that sit for a second. The Atlantic. Kimberly had written a 6,000-word essay about what she called the new editors, a generation of independent media builders rethinking what publications could be. Foundry was the anchor example. My portrait was the cover. My face. On the cover of The Atlantic. I found out from Kimberly with a 3-word text. Cover. Coming out Friday. I sat on my kitchen floor. The same kitchen where I'd been making notes since November. The same kitchen where I'd reheated soup for Sloan at midnight. The same kitchen where I'd sat the morning after the restaurant, opened my laptop, and started actually building the thing. I called my father. He picked up on the second ring, the way he always does. I told him. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, Caleb. Just my name, said in a specific way. And that was enough. I want to tell you about what happened with Nicole. Because this is one of the pieces of the story I didn't expect, and it matters. About a month before the Atlantic cover, Nicole reached out to me directly. We'd had coffee once since the breakup, a coincidental run-in near Bryant Park that had turned into an hour-long conversation. And she'd been thoughtful and genuine in a way that hadn't surprised me, because she'd always been that. She texted, Can we talk? Not about Sloan. About Foundry, actually. I want to tell you something. We met at a coffee shop in Midtown. She had a request and a confession. The request was, she wanted to invest. Small, she clarified immediately, not life-changing numbers, but real. She'd been watching the newsletter, had shared it with 2 colleagues, had come to believe it was going somewhere. The confession was harder. She told me about the question she'd asked Sloan. Do you see him in the life you're building? She said. Sloan said no. At least not the version of the life she was building then. She paused. I regret asking her that. Not because the question was wrong, but because I think I was asking her to measure you against something static, and you were never static. She looked at me carefully. I think she made a category error, Nicole said. She saw where you were and assumed it was the ceiling. I sat with that. And I think, Nicole continued, she is now aware that she was wrong. I looked up. She saw the piece. Kimberly's piece. The advance copy went to her firm. The Atlantic does some partner preview work with a few financial houses. She saw it before it was public. Quiet. Did she say anything? She called me. Nicole said. She didn't say much. Just, she was quiet. And then she said, I didn't see it. I didn't see it. I thought about that for a long time. Then I said, did you accept her investment? Nicole smiled. I'm accepting yours. I'm telling you about hers. The cover dropped on a Friday morning. I was at my desk at Vantage when it went live. Kimberly texted, "It's up." Marcus texted 30 seconds later with 6 words and 3 exclamation points. My phone started. Not viral famous started. Not strangers sending congratulations started. Just the quiet, specific, warm started of people who know you and have watched you work towards something, seeing it arrive. Former colleagues. Writers we'd published. People I'd lost touch with who somehow found the peace. My mother called and cried, which made me cry, which I was not prepared for. Russell sent a photo of himself holding the magazine in his apartment with an expression that I can only describe as vindicated on behalf of both of us. I went to a newsstand and bought 3 copies. Stood on the sidewalk and looked at the cover. It was a good photograph. I was serious and direct and looked, for the first time in my life, entirely like myself in an image. No performance. No adjustment. Just the person I had become over 12 months of early mornings and late nights and running through the cold and building something out of everything I'd been told was only a passion project. I walked back to my office. I did my job. And at 6 o'clock, I went to meet Russell for dinner at a place in the village to mark the moment quietly, between the two of us, the way we'd built everything else, without drama, without performance. Just 2 people who'd made something real. She was there. I want to be careful how I tell this part, because it wasn't a dramatic scene. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't the movies. The restaurant Russell had picked was one he'd been to once before and liked. He didn't know it was a place Sloane went sometimes. I barely remembered that myself until I walked through the door and saw her at a table near the window, with Declan, and Jeffrey, and Kimberly. I almost stopped walking. Then I didn't. Russell was already at the bar. I went to join him. I don't know exactly when she saw me. I noticed, from across the room, the moment it happened, the slight shift in her posture, the pause in whatever conversation was happening at that table. I didn't look directly at her. I ordered a drink. Russell ordered a drink. We clinked glasses. "To Foundry," he said. "To Foundry," I said. Kimberly came over within 5 minutes. She crossed the room with clear purpose, slightly laughing, and hugged me hard. "I can't believe you're here," she said. "Tonight of all nights." "Small city," I said. She pulled back and looked at me with warm, full contact eye contact. "You should be so proud," she said. "I am," I said. "And so should you. The piece is extraordinary." She shook her head. "I just wrote what was there." She went back to her table. I allowed myself, just once, to look over. Sloane was looking at me. Not with cruelty. Not with the composed performance I'd come to recognize as her social face. Just looking. The expression was hard to name. It wasn't quite regret. It wasn't exactly grief. It was something closer to the specific recognition you feel when you realize that your understanding of something was wrong. Not wrong in a small, fixable way, but structurally wrong. She had looked at me for 2 years and 8 months and seen where I was. She had never fully seen where I was going. I held her gaze for one moment. Then I turned back to Russell. And we talked and laughed and ate and drank and celebrated the thing we'd built. And at no point did I look over again. Because I didn't need to. After, Declan left Sloane's firm for a competitor 8 months later. I know this because things like that circulate. She's still there, still climbing. I genuinely hope she does. I don't say that as the gracious victor in a story. I say it because it's true. She is intelligent and capable, and the thing that hurt her wasn't her ambition. It was the instrument she'd chosen to measure people with. Jeffrey and Kimberly got married in June. I was there, not as a close friend of both, but as Kimberly's professional contact who'd become something closer to a friend over the course of a year. I sat near the back, watched the room fill with people who were building real things and loving each other through them. Nicole invested in Foundry at the end of our first year. Small as promised, but the gesture mattered more than the number. She's become someone I trust in a way that's different from how I trusted her when she was Sloane's best friend and I was Sloane's boyfriend who might not have a ceiling. Marcus is still my oldest friend. He came to every milestone, large and small, asked no dramatic questions, and was simply present the way the best people in your life are present, without agenda, without performance, without needing the credit. At Vantage, I transitioned to part-time consulting in month 9. Moved Foundry from a project to a full business. Our subscriber base crossed 40,000 in year 1. We were approached by 3 media companies interested in acquisition conversations. We had those conversations seriously, professionally, and ultimately declined all 3. We weren't finished yet. I moved from Astoria to a better apartment in Brooklyn. Not a grand statement, Just the practical acknowledgement that the life I was building deserved a space that matched it. I still run in the mornings. I still cook properly. I still have a bookshelf that is, at this point, slightly out of control. There's one more thing I need to tell you. About a month after the Atlantic issue, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "I owe you an apology. I know you don't need it, but I want to say it anyway." I looked at the number, sat with it. Then I understood. She'd gotten a new number at some point. I hadn't kept the old one. I held the phone. The person she was apologizing to was the person sitting at that restaurant table, who had absorbed her quiet contempt without flinching, who had signed the check and walked out with his dignity intact. The person she was apologizing to had already been paid. Not by her, by the work. By the months of early mornings and the newsletter and the writers who said yes, and Russell staying up late to get the design right, and Kimberly writing 6,000 honest words, and my father saying my name on the phone in a specific way. I put my phone down. I didn't respond. Not because I was punishing her. Not out of cruelty or performance. But because the conversation was over. It had ended in a parking lot in November with cold air and a quiet car and a decision to stop being someone who required apologies and start being someone who required nothing from anyone because he'd built something that stood on its own. People ask me sometimes, when they know the story or pieces of it, whether I'm glad it happened the way it did. The restaurant. The word embarrassed. The sentence she prepared and delivered and clearly thought was the honest thing to say. And I always think about it seriously before I answer. Because the honest answer is complicated. I wish she'd seen it differently. I wish the relationship had had room for the person I was becoming. I wish it hadn't taken a quiet humiliation to make me finally, completely commit to what I'd been building in the margins of a life organized around someone else's approval. But it did. That's the truth. That specific, terrible, clarifying sentence, said over wine at a restaurant we loved, by someone I loved, who believed she was being honest and was. That sentence was the reset. Not a gift. Not a lesson. Just the specific pressure point that cracked something open. And from the crack, eventually, everything grew. I think about the gallery sometimes. The opening where we met. The photograph she stopped in front of. The fire escape. The woman half visible. The extraordinary light doing ordinary work. "This one's trying too hard to be iconic," she said. "The ones in the back corner just are what they are. That's more interesting. Effort to impress shows. Effort to do the work doesn't." She was right. She was right about that from the very first thing she ever said to me. I was 29 years old at the beginning of this story. I'm 31 now. I run in the mornings. I built the thing. I became someone worth introducing. Just not to her.